we started off last session in terms of understanding, what exactly is common data environment and what this whole digitalization is about, etc. I think I just want to recap a little bit more about it and probably give you a little bit version of what exactly goes in CDE before I leave it to you and to take it forward. And as you know, we'll pitch in as we move forward. Um, and I would love to this session also to be very interactive. That way we would generate a lot of discussion, and that's what we are here about. Now, regarding common data environment, I think the key fact is captured by the sentence which is highlighted in the orange there. It's about having a version of truth for everyone, and that's what we emphasized in our last session as well. Just to recap a little bit of that. Um, so, let me just. So we started off with this whole idea that there are many versions of the truth, and we took this example of this six blind men and infants last time to understand that many all of us are right in our own perspectives, but may not have the entire picture, which would help us to achieve optimal results on construction. So that's the idea. And whenever you do have many versions of things floating around, many perspectives, then you tend to have this localized optimization in procedures, in design, etc., and that will not serve your purpose in the end. So that's the idea. And the interesting or the unfortunate thing about our state of affairs is that we may not be right in our perspective as well. While we touch, while we think about one version of it, our projection of it to the world might be very different. So that's the other aspect which we touched upon last time. So that's more or less about the first few things. And then we said, how does that translate into our world? Is this web of information which floats around between different agencies? I think this is a common slide which we also displayed last time, telling that there are a number of information flows between various stakeholders on construction projects, and that's where the source of information leakage or information misinformation is all about. And what we said is the role of CD is to streamline this whole web of information going around into a centralized data source. So that's more or less about CDE, what we said it last time, in a sense that when we are looking at digital project delivery, you are essentially looking at transforming this whole web of things which are entirely chaotic into a much more streamlined delivery of your project and your information, enabling your project delivery in a streamlined manner. So the idea of adopting any digitalization is to move away from the figure on our left hand side to the right hand side, where you have your digital models, you have your digital information, where people can access it and understand it. So that's the idea which we discussed last time. So essentially, if I kind of conclude that, to take it forward, what do we mean by common data environment? It means we are looking at a common agreed source of information, and every stakeholder who is on the project should agree to use this CDE solution. Whatever vendor software you are planning to do, it should be agreed contractually, and this would then serve as the common data source for all the data which is used in construction project. And the idea is to have these um, data documents in digital formats. So you have these digital formats of common versions of it for everyone. And what we call these data, when they come in sets, we call them information containers. So this is what I think a common data environment is all about. And when we come to information containers, we should understand that this information can be both structured and unstructured. What do I mean by structured? Structured is essentially you can have your models, you can have your schedules, you can have your different other kinds of things which are much more have a context and have a structure to it, or it could be plain PDF kind of drawings, documents, project contractual documents, all those documents which are digitized and which will flow through this solution or workflow in order to have that one version of truth floating around. So that's what we call about. So in the end, what does it promise? When you look at a common data environment, and if you establish a common data environment on a project, it means that you have agreed to store information for the project. The entire project information will reside in an agreed platform, and this platform will manage and control access to various stakeholders. It will give you some amount of versioning in terms of what is the latest version, what should be used on site, etc., etc. And then it will have some kind of ability in order to share and collaborate, so that you get information or a kind of a data which is usable for every other stakeholder. So essentially, it is to enable information that is available for each team member. That is what CDE is all about. So that's more or less, I think, probably what I would like to talk about, just to give you a very brief introduction to what common data environment is all about and what it promises. Essentially, we are looking at a common agreed source of information where all your structured and unstructured data goes in. So these can be documents which will give you a version control, and it will give you a kind of a platform to share and collaborate, so that you have one version of truth which can be used by different projects.
Venkat, just to kind of add on to that, if you really see, as a construction industry, probably we are getting to see more terms and terminologies. Most of the time we have typical stakeholders coming in, and sometimes we see some new. So sometimes they see BIM, sometimes CDE, sometimes stakeholders, sometimes the terms basically keeps changing. Now, probably picking up from what you just said, maybe I want to kind of coin a question to Ashwin. Ashwin, how different is this from a typical document management system? Are we glorifying document management system into a CDE? I mean, if that is too blunt, but then maybe you want to put some light on that.
Yeah, so let me see if I can. So I think the real answer is yes and no. I'm just sort of sharing one slide here. It's a little bit of a slightly different version of what Venkata shared. So this in some sense is building information modeling, right? So it is a three-dimensional model with all kinds of information that can help you with regards to conceptual design, detailed design, fabrication, construction, operation, etc. So in some sense, the common data environment, right, is very critical to be able to integrate all of this, all of this kind of data, maintain version control, and so on. So in that sense, it is not, I would say, completely dissimilar with a version management system or a document management system. The big difference, though, is that in a document management system, typically all documents are in the same format. Right. So typically you have Word documents, for instance, that are in that system. There may be different kinds of Word documents, etc. Here, all the documents could be in a variety of different formats. You have drawings of certain kinds, mechanical drawings, civil drawings. You might have procurement related information. Some of it might be textual. Some of it might be spreadsheet based. Some of it might be two-dimensional. Some of it might be three-dimensional. And so in some sense, I think this is if you want to use the document management system analogy, this is a document management system with a far higher level of complexity than the typical system where you essentially just put in some files and you have version control, right? So that's why I said yes and no. Yes, at its basic core, it is an information management system that allows multiple people to put in information without necessarily causing all this confusion in terms of which was the latest version and so on and so forth. But at the same time, it's far more richer because it allows you to integrate completely sort of contrasting or different kinds of information. So in some sense, I think if you take the analogy of computers, you really can't run a computer program of any sort if you don't have an operating system, right? Every computer comes with an operating system. It could be Windows, it could be the Mac OS, it could be Linux. The common data environment, I feel, is a bit like the operating system for BIM development, right? If you don't have an operating system, if you don't have a common data environment, it's not impossible, but it will be very, very difficult to really build rich BIM models that can then lead to good return on investment and so on, which I'm sure we'll talk about relatively soon, right? So I'll stop here, and I have some more to share as we go along.
I think you put a good point there, Ashwin, in terms of that the kind of environment that we have as compared to the other industries, maybe it's very complex, and that's where the common data environment integration of stakeholders makes a lot of sense. Now, just to add, like from my experience also in the similar line, manufacturing industry, if you see generally most of the DMS were intra-organization driven, and then if you look at most construction projects, they are quite inter-organizational collaboration, and that's where probably what you just said makes a lot of sense. Just picking up on that, if we really look at our stakeholder system, what you just showed, and different stakeholders. Now, these stakeholders are also from different organization. They will have different processes in each of their organization. Now, the level of complexity that we really look at about establishing a consistency here is, it could be quite challenging. So, maybe coming to you, Venkat, what do you think, standards from a standards perspective, is there a standard that, is available which generally governs the CDE practice globally, something which probably, has more, emphasis on implementation?
Yeah, I think I would like to touch on Professor Ashwin's comments, and I think we'll take it forward from there. I think the key thing what you see is how this is different from a document management system is the entire life cycle what you have seen, right? I mean, it comes where there are different stakeholders coming in from various organizations at very different points in time. So that's interesting. And the other part is essentially on top of our document management system, CDE enables workflows, right? I mean, the processes are inbuilt, and that is something which is also a very, very a powerful mechanism which will help your project delivery, right? And that is where precisely our the standards have focused across the world. If you look at different versions of standards which are in the development and which then took the form of an international standard, many of them not just looked at your modeling, which essentially is what the BIM and the digital revolution on construction was earlier about. It's not about the modeling, but it's about managing this information, right? So I think the various efforts, especially in the UK, and it has led to a number of standards. And finally, I think in the last few years, you see the standards from the International Standard Organization, the ISO 19650 has come up. And what you see is that the ISO 19650 has entirely focused on how to implement common data environment as part of digitalization in your projects. So let me just share a few slides on ISO 19650 so that it will help us understand what it is. I hope you can see my slides now. So if you look at ISO 19650, the very definition, and this comes pretty early in the standard itself, what it says is this. It says that it's an agreed source of information for any given project or asset. And this is a very interesting paradigm which ISO 19650 at least emphasizes on, where it says that finally it's all about the asset you are creating, right? It's not about the project, but it's about the asset you're creating, and finally how will it deliver value to your customers and end users, right? So essentially a project is about transforming or creating certain assets. So there is an asset, let's say it's a land, but then when you have a project, it's essentially transforming that land into a built facility, right? So it's all about transforming assets in order to make them more valuable to your business. And that's what your asset and project is about. And what CDE does is to enable you to add value to your asset, to manage your asset over its life cycle by doing these things which I have highlighted in yellow and orange. It's about collecting, managing, and disseminating. We talked about information containers in a little while earlier. It's about collecting, managing, and disseminating information, but through a managed process. So that's the idea. So a CDE essentially looks at what is to be collected, managed, and informed to other stakeholders, but it also looks at what are the managed processes in order to make this information much more viable for all the stakeholders, right? So let me just give you another idea about ISO 19650 and where it sits on and how CDE becomes pretty core for your entire digitalization process. As I think rightly pointed out by Professor Ashwin also, if you look at CDE, it sits on the very foundation of your entire digitalization journey. So if you look at the ISO 19650 standard, it says that if you want to implement BIM or any form of digitalization, the core technology is your CDE, which will enable your versioning, your management of information, your data models, and about sharing and collaboration, and also about looking at workflows, who will create, who will review, who will actually approve it, and when do you publish it, etc., etc. So that technology layer, which I think rightly coined like the operating system of your entire digitalization of the project, is your CDE. On top of that sits all the other things, your unstructured data like your project documents, etc., your structured data like your BIM models, etc., etc., all of them, and your clash-free, clash-detected, federated information models, all of them make use of this CDE and they move forward. And that's what the standardization talks about. It says that you establish your CDE first. You establish what are the objectives of your common data environment first, and then only you can reap benefits of your BIM models or any other fancy technologies which you want to adopt on your projects. So that's the first thing about CDE, what these standards talk about. Now, a very interesting thing what they also talk about is the CDE should manage this process, where they say that you have work in progress, right? Which is about when individual task teams develop it, but then you should also, the CDE should enable these whole idea of sharing and reviewing and authorizing. And once you have this iterative process of reviewing and also creating done, then only you can publish it. And this is access control, and this will be helpful in terms of understanding what is being built on the site, and also edit free or edit controlled or read only version of it needs to be archived in order to have a good documentation of what happened on the project. If, for example, there is something like some dispute which might arise or some documentation which is needed at a later point in time. So I would stop on ISO 19650 at this point, because I think we'll understand more about that as we move forward. But I think in terms of standards, the predominant focus of the standard, which is kind of the ISO 19650, is the international standard for digitalization right now across the world. The focus is on common data environment and the processes which common data environment enables in order to get that one version of truth.
Yeah, and so thanks for that elaborated response. And I think you touched upon a very important thing, ISO 19650. This was launched somewhere about December of, I think, maybe I'm just blanking, but very recently,
2018,
I don't know,
it started
2018,
2020.
yeah. So just before the COVID kind of a thing, 2018 kind of thing, it was launched. And this is the global standard which is available right now, which is also applicable to Indian conditions. The principles, the philosophy is very much applicable. So, maybe the audience later on, if they are not familiar with ISO 919650, you can just Google and, probably look at that. And, it's a must thing for all the practitioners and anybody from the project management or from the, from the asset management side of it to look at in terms of what is the new philosophy. Now, just picking up on what Venkat said right now, this is like one of the most important part of any tech deployment program. Uh, uh, Pardon me? Okay, this is one of the most important part of a tech deployment program. Looking at where he showed that CDE is the core of a lot of information that we are looking at in terms of various categorization of those information. So Ashwin, probably we would like to have your insight. Uh, uh, when we say that CDE is a low hanging fruit, why do we say that? And why you feel that probably from a tech implementation perspective, this could be something that people should be serious about in terms of considering as one of the easiest or probably a low hanging fruit.
Okay, so maybe again, let me share a few slides and yeah. So let's start off with, we are not implementing CDE for the sake of implementing CDE, right? Like I said, CDE is an operating system or a platform that allows you to do things that essentially enable your business to be more productive and more profitable. In this case, it allows you to more effectively build BIM models. Okay. So again, the next question is, why do you even build BIM models? Partly because BIM can be used in many ways to enhance efficiency, productivity, etc. on the project, right? There are many ways in which BIM can lead to advantages. So maybe just just for the sake of generalization, let me just go through a few. Of course, this slide is too small to read, but right. So BIM, for instance, allows you to photorealistically render buildings in 3D or structures in 3D. It may not be only buildings, it could be other kinds of infrastructure as well, and allows conversation between clients and contractors and designers to be able to identify issues early on, so that changes are not made at the last minute but are made primarily even before construction starts. And I'll tell you why all of this is important with regards to CDE being a low-hanging fruit in just a second. But let me go through a few uses first, right? So being able to visualize three-dimensionally, being able to do walkthroughs, play around with a model, those are some examples, some advantages of being able to bring in greater efficiency on a project. Typically, you have multiple disciplines on a project. You have civil engineering elements like beams, columns. You have mechanical, electrical elements, and all of these need to be very carefully reviewed, right? And using BIM models, one can very easily sort of understand the relative configuration between columns and beams and pipes and ducts and so on. And again, prior to construction starting, resolve any clashes, as it were, right? So that construction can proceed extremely smoothly, right? So this is again something that can add value to a business, right? If you actually implement it properly, right? Today, there's a lot of analysis that can be done on the design. Sustainability is a very important issue today, and the building industry needs to look at how it can reduce its carbon footprint. And one way of doing that is to analyze buildings to ensure that you're laying out buildings and using materials and so on that reduces the embodied carbon and also brings down the energy consumption, right? And again, BIM can allow you to do all of this analysis if you have the right kind of data in terms of interiors, materials that you're using, data in terms of the layout, data in terms of the latitude and longitude where the building is being situated and the microclimatic conditions and so on. Post design, BIM can add a lot of value in terms of being able to help you sequence the planning of the construction. So very often there are certain configurations of plans that might be inefficient, might lead to too many crews working at the same spot and therefore reducing productivity and so on. And you can therefore develop simulations using BIM, 4D simulations as we call them, to understand what would be the best construction sequence. and then implement a construction sequence that gets done as quickly as possible and therefore adds value. Right, and there are several other uses of BIM, being able to extract quantities from models and therefore very quickly provide estimates, but also very quickly compare the work that is done and the invoice that needs to be raised. So a lot of these processes that we used can be automated through the use of a BIM model. And of course, you can also produce documents. And there are several other uses, right? I'm not even going to get into all of them. You can directly fabricate elements using BIM and all of this. Now, if the point here is that BIM has a large number of uses in the design phase, in the construction phase, in the operations phase, but how do you realize these uses, right? If you want to really build good BIM models, you need multiple people to come together. So every example that I gave of the last couple of minutes in terms of these uses involved multiple pieces of information from multiple people. Design information from a civil engineer and a mechanical engineer, right? Design information from the architect and planning information from the contractor, right? Design information from the architect and information on the materials used for the interiors from sort of the interior design specialist, right? So multiple people need to come together and share that data in order for all of this to happen. What is the platform? How are they going to share this data? Of course, they can email it around, but you'll find that there are so many people with so many different kinds of data that that's not a very efficient system, right? And therefore, the common data environment becomes absolutely critical, right? You've got a number of people and all of them have to put data onto this platform in order for any of this to work, right? So that's what makes the common data environment extremely critical. In one sense, you can perhaps write off any return on investment if you don't have a common data environment. And the reason the common data environment is the low-hanging fruit is because it's one of the simplest things that you can implement, right? Unlike building a 3D model in a software, which actually involves knowledge about that software, sort of some amount of training, etc. Common data environments are far more intuitive. Yes, of course, there's a cost to the software package that you'll buy, but once you've sort of bought it and installed it, or once you've sort of put it up where people can access it, the ability to use it is extremely high and extremely easy. You do not need complicated training on it. So from that perspective, one of the first things that an organization should do is beyond just looking at the particular modeling tool or the particular analysis tool, all of which require quite a bit of training to use, right? Rather than sort of going in that direction, perhaps the low-hanging fruit is, first of all, create the common data environment where people can put in data, right? And then you can start worrying about how do I integrate this data? What are the best ways of doing it? What tools have what bells and whistles and so on, right? So in summary, the common data environment is going to be absolutely critical, right, to this entire BIM journey or story, as you might want to call it. And it's one of the easiest things to implement because it doesn't require a whole lot of training and so on. And therefore, I mean, that's why I would say that it is one of the low-hanging fruits in the entire BIM journey.
Ashwin, very well put together. And thanks for showing us the BIM uses. So if I just have to sum it up, it's like the amount of impact of change generally whenever we adopt any technology, CDE would probably have the least impact to any people, any workflow, any processes, and it can sink in well to your business where the first most important thing of bringing on board different stakeholders onto a digital environment can happen easily. Ashwin, one more thing. Please clarify that sometimes people think that CDE is all model-based thing. When we are looking at information, is it only 3D or we're looking at all kind of information?
Yeah, so I think thanks for asking that question, Sunil, because that's something that I think we need to clarify. So BIM models are not just built based on 3D geometry, right? The whole point, the I in BIM, the building information modeling is all kinds of information, some of which are represented, like I said earlier, in spreadsheets, in databases, in text format, etc. So the common data environment is not just a platform to share CAD drawings, for instance, right? It's a platform where you share a whole variety of information across formats, including non-graphical or non-geometric data.
Okay, great. I think thanks. And we'll pick it up from there. The most important word that we just spoke about, change. One of the reasons for probably calling it low hanging is that it has the minimum change impact. Now, just weaving on that, and if we look at maybe there was one recent article which said that close to about 40 to 50% of the traditional project management activities would become obsolete or become irrelevant in next 5 years due to the penetration of technology. So I would like to kind of come back to you, Venkat, with reference to the traditional project management processes and with reference to CDE or, similar technology that we have. Do you think that we are also trying to, get into a difference of, the way we manage projects, maybe trying to move more into an agile methodology? I mean, your views on that.
Yeah, I think I'll pick on the last keyword, right? Agile, what you said. I think as you can look at CDE, the emphasis is about sharing and collaborating, right? I mean, it's all about sharing and collaborating, and the inherent uh, fundamental process behind all this thing is the acceptance of iterations, right? Which is normally absent in a traditional project delivery mechanism. So if you look at traditional project delivery mechanisms, they are, if you look at waterfall kind of approaches, these are structured to be linear, right? I mean, you have your design process, then this, etc. Whereas the whole, the paradigm about agile and agile processes, if you look at the scrums and those kinds of things, I think the whole idea started off in understanding in bringing iteration to the core of your management philosophies, right? I mean, to understand that coordination, collaboration, and therefore iteration is there and is going to be there. Because if you look at requirement gathering, for example, nobody will get your requirements right the first time. I think all of us who are here, and more so people who are in the industry, would vouch for this, that a user cannot tell you their requirements at the first go because they do not even know about it, right? And as you look at it, and the very definition of project, if you look at PMBOK or any other guides to project management, they say that it's a venture where the information gets elaborated as you move on, right? And the idea is then to have a platform which can enable you to have this flexibility at its core. And the way, if you do it on our traditional ways to share information, and majority of would be on an email or other messaging platforms right now, you would see that there are a number of problems, right? First thing is there might be information mismanagement, in the sense that people may not get the right mail at the right time. Your versions might be different. All these kinds of problems associated with mail, etc., etc. Those are kind of always there. Whereas your CDE, when you have it at your core, and as Professor Ashwin emphasized earlier, it's not difficult to implement a CDE, because CDE weaves around your processes, right? And it does not necessarily mandate you to learn a modeling, or it to change the way you work, but it will change the platform on which you work, right? I mean, you can always design your processes surrounding CDE. Of course, there are a few things which will change if they are bad for your digital information or digitalization journey, but slowly that CDE can phase it out for you. You can always take out what is the best thing which can be implemented at a very quick time, so that you can attack one particular problem which you have. For example, if you have iterations, a lot of iterations, which will probably leading to a number of RFIs during execution, lot of rework, you can actually look at that portion, still work on your documents listing, still work on your AutoCAD drawings, but work on a CDE environment. But slowly, as you move forward, as Professor Ashwin was telling you, you can actually start implementing your modeling and then looking at those clash detections, etc., which is much better way in terms of getting your things right before you go onto the field. In that sense, let me just conclude all these thoughts which I've told you so far. I think if you look at CDE, I think it has in its core the collaboration and sharing feature, and therefore it's much more efficient in terms of bringing in agility and bringing in flexibility to your processes, bringing in that iterations possible to your processes, and therefore you will become much more open to adopt agile frameworks than the normal other whatever mechanisms you might have right now. So that's more or less how I sum it up for you.
Thanks, Ashwin. Thanks, Venkat, for putting it that elaborated response to that one. I'm sure most of the industry people would be able to relate to it. And when you spoke about PMBOK and the traditional project management and the agile Scrum way of working, just taking it to the probably next phase of our discussion. Whenever we talk about any technology, any initiatives. The biggest barrier sometimes is cost. People come up, and specifically in our region, cost has been a barrier, and there has to be motivation points for people to really go and deploy not just CDE, but essentially any a wider level of BIM adoption program. Ashwin, just I think on this subject, maybe I would like to have your insight in terms of what do you feel like, from a typical industry or any SME from the industry, if they want to deploy this, they want to go, like, what are the investment points? Like, what do they really have to invest in? And what kind of, what are the ROI indicators? Or maybe you can just give a, indication about why this makes a lot of, a good case for anybody to spend money in.
Yeah, thanks, Sunil. Again, I'm sort of sharing a couple of slides here. See, in terms of how much investment should you make, of course, that depends on which tool you're buying and what its features are. And the answer to that question today will be different from that answer to that question tomorrow. So I'm not going to get into numbers, but let's look at it from a return perspective. So generally, when you look at a construction project, these are some parameters that you want to measure yourselves on, right? So you want to be extremely safe. You want to have excellent quality and performance of the structure. You want to be on time and on budget. So cost variance and schedule variance should be minimal. More and more you're looking at sustainability, right? And perhaps globalization may or may not be very relevant, today. So you want to score. So this is sort of a chart that I took from the Center for Integrated Facilities Engineering at Stanford University. It's prepared a while back. But these are some parameters that you want to achieve on your projects. And the question I would like to ask is, to what extent can having a common data environment facilitate the use of BIM to be able to achieve, to what extent can you actually achieve improvements on these parameters by using things like the common data environment? So let me show you some real data. Okay, there is a company called DPR Construction in the US, and they actually did, really accounted for all the benefits that they had by building BIM models supported by a common data environment. And when you look at some of these metrics, right, they're fantastic. So for instance, rather than going through all of these, let's just get to metric number 6 at the bottom, right? The amount of rework that is done, right, essentially vanished to 0, right? Primarily because you had done all the coordination ahead of time, because you used a common data environment, put all of the data in, use some tools to analyze that data, and therefore you got the project right the first time. There was really no rework done. And what this does is it actually then saves you a lot of money, because if you have to do rework, then essentially you have to spend more in terms of labor and material and machinery and so on, right? Similarly, many of these other metrics are also equally impressive, right? So for instance, the cost performance was more than 95%, which means you are more or less on budget, subject to a few minor variations. The number of RFIs or requests for information generated on the field was less than 1% of what was normally generated, right, on a construction project. Again, you can see how you are now able to meet cost and save a lot of time. And as we know, time is money, right? So there are all of these savings that you could then quantify on your project. All right. So this is, I think, where the return comes in, right? You get return in terms of cost compliance, you get returns in terms of schedule compliance, you get returns in terms of quality, you get returns potentially in terms of sustainability, and so on. Okay. Now, one thing that people sometimes do when they see something like this is they say, oh, you're giving examples from the USA, right? So maybe it works in the US, will it work in India? Right now, I just realized I forgot to put that slide in this deck, but we did a very, very similar exercise in India, and others have done this as well with the military engineering services. Close to Chennai, there's something called the Officers Training Academy, and there was a construction that was coming up, and we actually implemented BIM there and measured what the impact would have been. And essentially, we found very, very similar results, right? And we generally found that the savings, when you quantify, right, were somewhere in the region of about 8% of the overall project value, right? At least that was what we got in our example, 4 to 8% of the overall project value, which is tremendous. I mean, in some cases, that's your entire profit margin right there as a, as a client or as a contractor, right? So I think in terms of return on investment, there is a cost, of course, that you're spending, and that will, of course, vary. But your return is not directly in terms of money that you get, but it's really more in terms of money that you save by doing higher quality work, by being more compliant on time and cost, by being more sustainable, and so on. And I think the evidence shows us that even in India, that is quite significant. And remember, once you get subscriptions to the common data environment, right? I mean, those are subscriptions that you could potentially use across projects. And therefore, as you sort of get into the long-term game, your returns sort of increase. So the return on investment is there on using common data environment and then using BIM tools on top of it. It could be in the 4 to 8% sort of region, which I think is significant, looking at the overheads and margins in the construction industry, but it could also be higher depending on how mature your implementation is. So Sunil, that would be my answer to that question.
I think that's a very lucrative number, specifically with reference to most of the places where the sale prices are getting tighter because of competitive environment, and then you're looking at savings as one of the means to add on to your profits. I think that makes a lot of compelling pitch, and I just want to add up, connect probably what Venkat said. CDE helps in making our process more agile. The moment we make it more agile, we are trying to remove a lot of inefficiency from it. And with what Ashwin just showed, if I just sum it up, there are the cost, like one of the major cost indicators which probably helps is the time, both in terms of the turnaround time as well as the gross time, because of the availability of information at the right time and the quality of information also, which is available, which can help him in terms of making the right decision. Now, I've been practicing in the industry, and I've seen that with CDE implementation, specifically with reference to real estate or construction or GC environment, we will see that there is a lot of savings of the time of the senior people in terms of availability of those information, plus risk. A lot of people carry risk related to RERA and other stuff, because having a centralized environment and having a CDE like a platform that helps in terms of mitigating a lot of risk. Now, coming on to that, maybe that just one aspect of the risk, I just probably prompted, but maybe Venkat, when we look at CDE and looking that as a platform and as an IT platform, what risk do you think a user or any person who is implementing it would have?
Okay. Yeah, just to start off this discussion, I think first thing is the implementation of CDE would help you to reduce your risks, related to data, etc. Let me just share a slide on this, which can put this in perspective. Not much. We'll just look at some data risks which are associated with this whole idea of CDE, and where CDE can help and where some concerns still remain. So if you look at data risks, for example, I can always look at internal, which is essentially what you have as a project team, whether you belong to a client or a contractor, within your own teams, what kind of risks you have? For example, the idea of what's the latest version of the design which you have to probably give it to it, what kind of data which which you create, who will create it, who will be the issuing authority, these kinds of questions. And this is where the risks related to data would come down a lot when you start using common data environment, because now you have a very set processes. You can define your workflows. You can say if an information is created by this person, it should go escalate. If that person did not really come back on this, then it can escalate. All these kinds of workflows can be defined in your CDE, right? So that internal data risk in terms of things can come down. And going by this extreme events like accidental data purges, etc. That itself it will come down to zero. You cannot accidentally delete anything on a CDE platform because you have a versioning system. You can always get back your things, right? So that's something which you have to understand. The second one is when it comes to a project level, this is essentially across the stakeholders. Then the concerns about transparency or access, right? What information should go to what stakeholders. When you have your shared data models, shared environments, then you might spill information which you don't want some of your stakeholders to actually look at, etc. That is something which is existing, but with the access control, with the kind of features you have in CDE, you can always restrict what versions, what version will the other stakeholders look at, etc. Right? So that's something the project stakeholders should think about, what for every information container. And that is where CDE exposes this. In the normal processes, this remains with the project's mindset, what to expose, what not to expose, but it will force you to think about it when you implement CDE. So you have to think, okay, this version of this information, it should not go to this stakeholder. That kind of thinking will be out in open among your team members, at least when you start implementing this, right? Finally, if you look at external, these concerns still remain, but there are things about, for example, what would happen to my project data, right? I mean, many of the vendors right now you have your subscription based kind of thing. So what happens if I stop my subscription, for example? Where will the data be stored? What would happen to my data? How do you ensure the persistency of data, etc. Right? So that thing one remains. And then, for example, in the long-term nature, if I want to pick up something, some archive, etc., would I have it in my premises, or where is this data stored at all? Is it beyond the country? Where is it? So these kinds of concerns still remain, but I think people are working around it. Like every CDE offers you a customized solution based on your data requirements and the risk related things. Especially, for example, if you are from a government sector and you want your data to be stored in a in a particular format in a particular location, that would also be ensured. But it all comes with this. Finally, I think I would like to leave with, and I think I'll take a cue from Professor Ashwin when he showed something from Sci-Fi. I think one question which again people pose, especially who are in this business of CDE, etc., is what would happen if CDE is not there? Do you think your processes would become efficient in spite of CDE? That's one question which you have to answer. Because common data environment, do you really think without adopting, are you able to manage your data, etc., etc.? If concerns remain, you would see that if you employ CDE, the risks actually reduce a bit, right? I mean, the question to ask is the other way around. Instead of asking what's the return on if I implement it, you might have to start asking, what am I losing if I'm not implementing CDE? And there is a lot to lose if you don't implement CDE and move on to the agile processes which you are also talking about, Sunil.
Okay, that's really great. So Venkat, I think just touching on that data risk part of it, I think to our users, maybe, just to sum it up, it's very important to probably, ask questions whenever they get into the rollout of, any CD platforms, or when they are choosing the software for that, specifically asking questions like where the data will be, where it is going to reside, in case of calamities, will you have access to data? So that decides most of the time the sensitivity of the information we keep. Sometimes we keep like, multiple micro versions of CDE for some sensitive data with very limited control in a macro version, probably with a wider access. Now, access and software, this is something which can be very specific to case, but then knowing where your data is going to be, like you just touched upon, is very important. So it's all a play of digital data. So ask this question to anybody who comes with a software vendor, or anybody comes in terms of where my data is going to be, because your data ultimately is going to be more costly than the software in future. So, data is the next oil or next gold. So now I think, we have looked at different aspects, and, come to probably a stage where, you have also explained the data part of it. Ashwin, now, if somebody is really interesting, now we are getting some real questions. Somebody is asking, saying that which are the softwares now? Coming to ground reality, in terms of which are the software that I need to buy, or, so I think we can just touch upon that question separately. But then more important is, what are the challenges do you see, if anybody wants to implement this, what are the challenges do you want to see?
Yeah, thanks, Sunil. So, like you said, I mean, I'm not going to get into what software should you buy, because, I think essentially we're not evangelizing one particular software over the other, at both at CDCP India and also, I guess, in our own capacities. So we can sort of discuss the pros and cons. But like you said, adoption, right? So how do we get people to do this? So again, I'll share a few slides. So this whole thing we've talked about, the CDI, BIM, all of that, unfortunately, it doesn't work by itself, right? I know a number of people, as you've said, are raising issues on technology costs, right? How much is it going to cost? That is a little bit of a barrier. Up until today, probably people had no real data on the ROI. And again, that was difficult to justify the purchase. The industry is extremely fragmented. So one of the challenges is, how do you get everybody to use the same platform? I might already have made an investment in one platform. You might have made an investment in another CDE. Who are the people who sort of understand how to work this? And also there's a general aversion to change that you find in every industry. So there are, as you can see, the cards are stacked against you. Okay. So how does this, how can this potentially happen? There needs to be a process. That process can be called by many, and of course there are no industry standards as well. Sorry, I left that out. So there are a few things that sort of need to be done in my case, right? In my opinion, to enable adoption. All right. The first thing is to set up sort of a process framework that allows you to leverage the common data environment. And in this process framework, a few things are critical, right? We've got to be very clear in terms of what are the goals of what you want to achieve with regards to your project and the use of CDE, right? If you just go in saying, I will buy this tool, I will implement it and magic will happen, no, that is not going to be the case, right? So we're going to have to put in, we're going to have to define, are you looking at a reduction in the time taken to answer requests for information? Are you trying to reduce all kinds of clashes? I mean, what are your goals? And also very importantly, what are the roles that you will create within the organization to make all of this happen? So who's going to be in charge of cleaning up the CDE, who's going to be in charge of version control, who's going to be the interface between the people working digitally and the people working physically, and so on. What are the various collaborative procedures that you're going to sort of put in? Are people just going to use the CDE as a repository, check in, check out material as they like, or are they going to be sort of collaborative meetings that you're going to have around a particular piece of analysis? Right? And finally, from a contractual perspective, how do you incentivize everybody to come to the table? Because ultimately, each vendor or sub-consultant is worried more about their profitability than necessarily bringing all of this information together. So if you don't have these four things, if you don't have a clear set of goals, if you don't have a clearly identified set of roles, right? In many cases, people have had the mistake of saying, look, can you also look after the CD? And unfortunately, people in the construction industry are busy. The job is already a 24/7 job. You really have no bandwidth to take additional charge of the CDE or the modeling and so on. And so you need specialized roles for this. You need procedures in terms of how people will share information, collaborate, perhaps contracts as well. Sometimes we refer to this as integrated project delivery, IPD, but you need a process like this. So that's part one of this. That process can be enabled by things like execution plans, BIM execution plans that you write prior to a project. And these BIM execution plans need to very clearly delineate what is the role of the common data environment, what kind of environment are you going to use, what are the information exchange requirements, things like that, right? So, and I'm not going to get into this in detail today. That could be the subject of a different webinar. So these are one set of ideas. Another sort of complementary set of ideas is that very often you have you need sort of implementation that's able to match the capabilities on the ground, right? Very often what people do is they try to go in for a very complicated implementation of both the CDE and the models on top of it. And because they don't necessarily have the capability, the results are not quite there, as a result of which the entire process gets a bad name. Right? So it's very important to have a meeting between the top-down and bottom-up approaches, what top management wants to see, what's capable in terms of the skills available, the budget available, the tools available from the people on the field who are actually implementing these, and come to a little bit of a happy mean in terms of what can be implemented, and use that as a stepping stone to build outwards, right? Maybe start with very simple implementations up front, where you're essentially only bringing a few geometric models together and detecting clashes, to much more complicated implementations as capability is built in, right? So I think these are a few things that need to be done for adoption to happen, because it is very clear that adoption does not happen automatically. It's not a question of purchasing the software. It's more a question of setting up the processes that allow you to leverage that software.
Great. So Ashwin, just picking up on that, I would like to add like a little bit point, couple of key, there cannot be a better time than this for construction industry for tech development. And I'll tell you the reason, because when Venkat talk about agile and then data, if you look at, there are key technological evolution which is happening, which is facilitating this change management process or the adoption process. And, so just adding to what Venkat said, number one, the cloud technology. If you really look at the access of data today, if you want to deploy a DMS or if you want to deploy a CDE, we are not talking about you be putting big servers in your office. That those days are gone, where today you are getting hostages in much cheaper rates, in much more affordable rates as compared to what it used to be probably 10 years or 20 years back. Number two, the internet. Now, construction industry is like collaborating between multiple offices, which are sometimes located in different regions. And if you look at today with reference to the availability of internet in the country, that's making it easier for us to access the data on the cloud. So cloud availability of internet. And then the second thing is a lot of evolution that has happened within the different BIM use software that Ashwin spoke about. When we look at those softwares today, 20 years back, those software even had no way of talking to each other. Like each software was like very heavy duty software, which was very limited to their own formats and file. But today it's getting more collaborated. We're talking open BIM, the transactions between the data between these softwares are happening. Now, these are some of the key trigger points that is facilitating the adoption. And probably, these were the barriers if I would have taken some time back, like, from a challenge perspective. Today, because of these things, the biggest challenge has been reduced. From my perspective, Ashwin, if I have to just sum it up and open up the forum for question, is the last one is, I believe that in India, from an implementation perspective, I believe that the mindset and the culture of the organization has been the biggest enabling and the disrupting factor when it comes to the speed in which they are able to adopt the technology. Okay, so thank you guys, and then I just now open the the session for the audience. If you have any questions, we have the last probably 15-20 minutes left. We would be very happy to make this discussion interactive. And we also have our president here, Swaraj Datta Gupta. So if if you don't have the question coming in, maybe Swaraj, I would like to invite you to kind of maybe add your point, being an expert advisor yourself.